There's a terrible secret in the work of a surgeon, one we never speak aloud, not even to each other. Sometimes the person who ends up on the table under our hands is someone we'd rather see anywhere else in the world. And in that moment, the only thing standing between you and the patient's death is your own conscience, which is so easy to betray. That night, I stood over the woman who had destroyed my life, holding a scalpel. And only two people on earth knew that whether she'd be breathing an hour from now depended entirely on a single decision I made. Me and God. And God, it seemed, was silent. It was 2:30 in the morning when the emergency department alarm went off. I can still feel it. It soaked into me the way antiseptic soaks into the skin of your hands and won't wash out no matter how much soap you use. I'd been on my feet for nearly 2 days without real sleep. One shift had run into the next because my young colleague had gone down with a high fever and they'd asked me to stay. I stayed. I always stayed. That's probably what destroyed my family in the end, but I'll get to that later. That night, the only things keeping me upright were strong hospital coffee and a particular kind of sharp, bitter focus that comes when exhaustion pushes past every limit you thought you had and turns into something strange and ringing and calm. The emergency surgery ward at that hour felt like a ship cutting through a storm in total darkness. The long corridors were swallowed in the muted bluish glow of the night duty lights. Somewhere a monitor beeped steadily, counting out someone else's heartbeat. The air smelled of chlorine, alcohol, and that particular hospital chill you couldn't mistake for anything else. I just managed half a cup of cold tea when the doors to the receiving bay flew open and a blast of cold air rushed in with them. A paramedic team pushing a gurney in ahead of them. "Give me everything at once," I said, pulling on gloves as I moved. The young paramedic was breathless, firing off numbers. Female, approximately 35, fall from height, estimated 3rd floor, unconscious, blood pressure dropping, tachycardia, suspected internal hemorrhage. As I listened, my mind was already running like a well-calibrated machine, cutting away everything irrelevant and laying out the sequence of steps. That's what had saved me my whole life. In moments when an ordinary person freezes with fear, I go completely cold. My hands stop trembling. My thoughts line up in a clean, straight row. I stop being a woman and become an instrument honed for a single purpose, pulling someone's life back from the edge of the void. We wheeled the gurney into the exam room. I leaned over the patient and the shadowless lamp blazed down onto her face. And every last piece of that calibrated machine, all of that cold composure, shattered like a glass ball dropped on a concrete floor. I recognized her. I'd only seen that face once before, and only briefly, in a small photograph on someone else's phone, the one my husband had carelessly left unlocked on the kitchen table 2 years ago. One face, one photograph. It had burned itself into my memory like a brand. This was a woman who had taken everything I'd built over 15 years. This was a woman whose name my husband had spoken on the evening he packed a suitcase and told me he was leaving, for someone who finally made him feel alive. Someone who knew how to love rather than cutting people open in bloody operating rooms. Her, this exact woman who was now lying in front of me, white as a sheet, lips turning blue, her pulse barely there. I went still. For one endless moment, the whole world collapsed down to the size of that exam room. I could hear my own heart thudding. Something dark and hot rose inside me. Something I hadn't even known was there. It was almost animal. There she was, the woman who had taken everything from me. The woman I'd cried over at night in my cold car, biting my lip to keep from screaming out loud. The woman whose name I'd forbidden myself even to think. And right now, her life was literally draining away, and all I had to do was slow down just a little. Just hesitate, just for a moment. Just allow myself to be a tired, ordinary human being for a few minutes instead of a surgeon. And no one could ever hold me accountable. A fall from the third floor, critical condition, blood loss. Patients like that don't make it. That's medical statistics. No one would call it my fault. The anesthesiologist was saying something to me. I could see his lips moving, but couldn't hear a word. The nurse touched my sleeve. "Doctor," she was saying. "Doctor, are you all right? Do we start?" And right then, in that exact second, just as the dark wave inside me was cresting, I looked at my hands. These dry, worn, chapped hands with their close-cut nails. Hands that had pulled hundreds of people back from the edge over 17 years. Hands that had never asked who was lying in front of them, saint or scoundrel, rich man or vagrant, friend or enemy. These hands knew only one thing. As long as a person is still breathing, you fight for them. And I understood that if I betrayed those hands right now, if I let hatred shift the scalpel by even a hair, I would stop being myself. I would become something else. The very thing my husband had once called me in anger, only in reverse. I would become a monster, and then he'd be right. And I couldn't let him be right. Not like that. Not at the cost of someone else's life. "Prep the OR," I said. I barely recognized my own voice. It was so level, so steady. Not a trace of the storm raging underneath. Large pre-op room. 2 blood types ready for transfusion. Gets a second team in. Now. Everything started moving. The gurney rolled down the corridor, the ceiling lights flashing past overhead. I walked alongside it, holding the IV line, looking into the deathly pale face of the woman I hated more than anyone in the world. And the strangest thing was that in that face, helpless now, unguarded as a child's, there was nothing of the predatory other woman my imagination had been conjuring for 2 years. She was just a woman, just a person, standing at the very edge. We rolled into the OR. Harsh light hit my eyes. Equipment hummed to life. Someone handed me an instrument. I leaned over the open surgical field, drew a slow breath, feeling my ribs answer with a dull ache from hours of exhaustion. And then I moved my hand over the woman I'd wanted to erase from this world just 5 minutes before. And I started saving her life. I didn't know then that this night would change everything. That the woman on the table would turn out to be nothing like who I thought she was. That the real monster had been somewhere else entirely all this time. And that the truth I'd come face to face with in a few hours would be more terrifying than any hatred. But I'll get to all of that in order. They say a surgeon's hands are smarter than her head. That night I finally knew it was true. While my mind was tearing itself apart, while resentment and old pain churned inside me, my fingers did their work with cold, flawless precision. They didn't know hatred. They knew only anatomy, only the count of seconds, only the thin line between life and death that I walked that night like a tightrope walker over an abyss. The bleeding was worse than I'd expected. Inside, there was real devastation. The fall had damaged several organs, and one major vessel was torn badly enough that blood was pouring out fast, filling the abdominal cavity. The anesthesiologist on the other side of the drape watched the monitor with tight concentration, and I could hear the strain creeping into his voice. "Pressure's 40/0, doctor. She's going." "Hold her," I said through my teeth without looking up. "Just hold her. She's not going anywhere." And as I said it, somewhere at the very edge of my awareness, beyond my control, something else surfaced. That evening, 2 years ago. I can see it as clearly as if it were yesterday. Our small entryway, my husband standing by the door, hurriedly zipping up his jacket, a packed suitcase on the floor beside him. He isn't looking at me. He's looking somewhere off to the side, at the coat rack, at the wall, anywhere but at me. "You don't know how to live, Anya," he says quietly, and there's no anger in his voice, only a tired, condescending pity that cuts deeper than any shouting ever could. You always smell like a hospital. You come home wrung out, you fall into bed and you're gone. You can't even remember the last time we just talked. I'm a living person, I need warmth. Being with you is like being in a morgue. I'm sorry. And with her? I asked. I still remember the way my own voice broke. With her? Are you alive? He said nothing, and that silence said more than any answer could. Clamp, I said aloud, and the nurse placed the instrument in my hand. I found the source of the bleeding, clamped the damaged vessel, and for a few seconds the operating room went quiet. Nothing but the steady beeping of the monitor. Got it, the anesthesiologist breathed. Pressure's coming up. 50, 60, holding. Don't celebrate yet, I said. We're just getting started. There were still long hours ahead. I placed suture after suture, rebuilding what the fall had destroyed. Sweat ran down my back beneath the sterile gown, and my lower back ached like something was driving nails into it, but I didn't let myself so much as straighten up. In moments like these, time disappears. There's only the operative field, only the steady rhythm of the ventilator, only your hands, stitching someone else's torn life back together millimeter by millimeter. And here's the strange thing. The longer I worked on this woman, the quieter it got inside me. The hatred that had flooded through me in the exam room retreated with every suture I placed. Because you can't hate a person whose heart you're literally holding in your hands. You can't wish harm on someone you're fighting for with everything you have left. Something happens in those minutes between a surgeon and a patient that can't be put into words. You become closer to her than anyone in her life. You know her body in ways no one else does. You see her at her most exposed, her most defenseless. And all the noise, all the grievances, all the names and roles we pin on each other in ordinary life. Under these lights, none of it means anything anymore. At some point, her heart stopped. The monitor screamed a flat, piercing line, and that sound went through me like a blade. "Asystole," the anesthesiologist called out. "She's crashing." And in that moment, that single most terrifying second, there wasn't a trace of the old hurt left in me. I'd forgotten who she was. I'd forgotten everything. I remembered only one thing. She was not allowed to die on my table. "Start compressions," I ordered, and we began resuscitation. I worked harder than I think I'd ever worked in my life. 1 minute, 2, 3. "Come on," I was whispering through my mask. "Come on, breathe. Listen to me. Don't you dare leave." And she came back. The monitor flickered, the flat line broke, and the rhythm returned. Weak, irregular, but alive. "We have a pulse," the anesthesiologist breathed, and it felt like the whole operating room exhaled with him. My legs nearly gave out, but I held. I couldn't afford to fall. The work wasn't finished. 2 more hours passed before I placed the final suture and straightened up over the table. Pain shot through my back so sharply, my vision went dark at the edges. I stripped off my gloves, wet with sweat on the inside, and looked at the woman lying in front of me. She was alive. Her vitals were slowly, steadily leveling out. She was going to live. "Take her to the ICU," I said. "Don't take your eyes off her. Any change at all, call me immediately." I walked out of the operating room, leaned my back against the cool wall of the corridor, and slowly slid down it until I was sitting on the floor. I was shaking. Not even from exhaustion, really, more from a kind of strange hollowness. I had just saved the life of a woman I was supposed to hate. And instead of triumph, instead of satisfaction, instead of even a flicker of vindictive pleasure, there was only a ringing emptiness and one thought I couldn't shake loose. Why? Why had fate brought her, specifically her, to my table, specifically my table, on this particular night? That kind of thing doesn't happen by accident. It just doesn't. I didn't know that the answer was already waiting for me, just a few steps away. At the nurse's station down the hall sat an ordinary handbag. The patient's belongings brought in by the paramedics and waiting to be logged according to protocol. The nurse on duty saw me sitting on the floor, walked over and said, "Doctor, her things are here. The ambulance crew dropped them off. I need to log them, but I'm the only one at the station and I'm completely swamped. Would you mind taking a look? There should be ID in there. I just need the information written down." I didn't know yet that in a few minutes I'd open that bag and my life would split into before and after. Never go through other people's things. My mother taught me that. And my whole life I'd kept that rule without question. But that night I broke it. And you know what? If I could go back, I'd do it again. Because sometimes a single small zipper opens not a bag, but an abyss. One you'd been falling through for 2 years without ever knowing it. I took the bag and carried it to the empty doctor's lounge, sat down at the desk under the dim table lamp. Outside the rain was still coming down, that same relentless autumn downpour that seemed determined that night to wash every living thing from the face of the earth. The bag was expensive, good leather, but worn, marked by long use. For some reason, that detail caught me. In my imagination, the other woman had always lived in luxury, bathed in my husband's money, draped in furs and gold. But this bag belonged to an ordinary woman who clearly knew the value of things. I unzipped it. Inside was the usual chaos a woman carries with her: lipstick, keys, a crumpled tissue, a half-empty package of sedatives, a cheap phone with a cracked screen, and again, that detail didn't fit the image I'd built of a kept woman. I found the passport, opened it to copy down the information the nurse had asked for, read the name. The very name my husband had spoken in our entryway 2 years ago. So I hadn't been wrong. It was her. My hands were trembling slightly as I wrote the information into the log. And then, as I was putting the passport back, my fingers found something at the bottom of the bag. A hard, rectangular shape. A thick folder held shut with a rubber band. I shouldn't have touched it. I knew I shouldn't. But something inside me, whether the instinct of a surgeon trained to look for causes where others only see symptoms, or simple human curiosity or fate itself, made me pull that folder out and slip off the rubber band. Inside were documents, a lot of documents. And the first thing that caught my eye was an official letterhead with an embossed seal. A formal complaint filed with law enforcement. I skimmed the first lines and my heart sank. The woman had filed a complaint about fraud, about being deceived out of the apartment her late mother had left her, about how someone she trusted had forged documents, transferred the title of her only home into his own name, and thrown her out onto the street with threats. I read it twice. Something didn't add up. The other woman, the woman my husband had left his family for, the woman he'd gone to for a better life, and suddenly this. Deceived, homeless, driven to desperation. I turned the page. What followed were medical records. Not mine, from another clinic. As a doctor, I had no trouble reading the diagnoses, and they made me deeply uneasy. Nervous exhaustion, depressive disorder. Signs of treatment following what the records delicately referred to as domestic injury, though we in medicine tend to understand that phrase in a very different way. This woman hadn't been living in luxury. This woman had been slowly falling apart. Someone had been breaking her down, methodically, deliberately, year after year. I leaned back in my chair. My head was buzzing. The picture I'd spent 2 years carefully constructing, the one where I was the abandoned victim, my husband the traitor, and she the cunning predator who'd stolen my happiness, that picture was beginning to crumble like plaster of an old wall. Something here was deeply, fundamentally wrong. I should have stopped. I knew it. But I couldn't anymore. I went through the documents one by one, and with every page I grew colder. copies of correspondence, signed receipts. A contract drawn up so cleverly that an ordinary person would never have spotted the trap buried in the fine print. Someone very smart and very ruthless had played this woman for a fool, stripped her of everything she had, and thrown her away when she was no longer useful. And then, at the very bottom of the folder, I found an envelope. An ordinary white envelope, unmarked, slightly creased. Inside was a sheet of paper, folded in quarters. I unfolded it, and all the air left my lungs at once, as though someone had driven a fist straight into my chest. I recognized the handwriting, that neat, slightly right-leaning script with its distinctive loops. I'd have known it among 1,000 others. For 15 years, I'd found notes written in that hand on the refrigerator every morning. For 15 years, I'd read those same letters on my birthday cards. It was my husband's handwriting. And the letter I was holding in my trembling hands had been written by him, to her. But it wasn't a love letter, oh no. It was something else entirely. And what I read in those lines forced me to understand something simple and terrible. For 2 years, I'd been hating the wrong person. The real enemy had been sitting much closer all along. And his name was my own husband. There's a particular cruelty in learning the truth too late. For 2 years, I'd been grieving my marriage. For 2 years, I'd seen myself as the victim and her as the woman who'd stolen someone else's happiness. For 2 years, I'd gone to bed with that bitterness and woken up with it still there. And all that time, the truth had been lying nearby, folded in quarters inside a white envelope, waiting for its moment. It found that moment on a rainy night in an empty on-call room, under the dim light of a desk lamp. And that moment crushed me. I read the letter, and the words blurred before my eyes. My husband hadn't written to this woman as a man in love. He'd written as a man giving orders. He reminded her of some debt. He demanded that she sign papers he'd be passing along to her. He wrote that if she refused, she'd regret ever having been born. He wrote coldly, calculatedly, with a quiet certainty of someone who has another person by the throat and knows it. And gradually, piecing together the fragments from all those documents, I began to understand what had actually happened. The picture took shape in front of me, appalling in its simplicity and its ugliness. My husband had never loved this woman. He'd used her. She owned an apartment in a good neighborhood, an inheritance from her mother. And apparently there was also some sum of money, an insurance payout or savings. I never did work out all the details that night. He'd moved in on her with the patience of a predator stalking its prey. He'd earned her trust, performed affection, turned the head of a lonely woman who was desperate for warmth. And then, slowly, step by step, he'd taken everything she had. And me, his wife, he'd used too. As a cover, as a convenient shield, as a reason for people to feel sorry for him. He'd left gracefully, staging the whole thing to look like a sad story of a man misunderstood by his cold, workaholic wife who had finally found real love. What irony. What a calculated, elaborate lie. I thought back to that scene in the hallway with completely different eyes now. How he hadn't looked at me. How he'd packed his suitcase in advance. How smoothly those words had flowed, almost rehearsed, about how I didn't know how to live and smelled like a hospital. I'd taken it all at face value then, because I was shattered and couldn't think straight. But now I saw an actor. A cold-blooded, talented actor performing a script he'd written well in advance. He needed me broken, guilty, retreating without a fight, and I dutifully played my part. Among the papers I found something else, a draft. Her own draft, written in a shaking hand, of that very statement to the authorities, in which she tried to explain what had happened. And there, between the lines of formal language, raw human pain kept breaking through. She wrote that she'd believed him, that he'd seemed like salvation to her, that she'd been completely alone after her mother died, and he'd appeared at exactly the moment when things were at their worst. That she'd have given him everything herself if he'd only asked. But he didn't ask. He took by force and deception. And when he'd taken everything, he began getting rid of her. First coldness, then threats, then something worse. Something those medical records I'd read earlier had described. And at the very end of the draft was a sentence that made my throat tighten. She wrote that she couldn't go on living like this, that she was tired of being afraid, that she felt there was no way out. I set the papers down and sat for a long time staring at the dark window. The rain kept falling, and I thought about how strangely life is arranged. Two women, completely different. We were supposed to hate each other, and we did, at a distance, each in our own way. She'd almost certainly seen me as the wife who'd made her beloved miserable, because that was exactly how he'd framed it for her. I had no doubt about that now. And I'd seen her as the woman who'd broken up my home. And all that time, the same person had been playing us both. One puppeteer pulling the strings of two lives, setting us against each other, hiding behind first one and then the other, and walking away without a scratch. And yet, a fall from the third floor. I suddenly remembered what the paramedic had said. A fall, presumably accidental. But now, after everything I'd read, that presumably felt far more sinister. A woman who had filed a complaint against someone accustomed to escaping all accountability. A woman who knew too much and had finally decided to fight back. And then she falls from a height and arrives in critical condition. How convenient, how well timed. I felt genuinely afraid, not even for myself, for her, lying helpless in the intensive care unit just a few meters away from me. Because if what I was beginning to suspect was true, her fall hadn't been an accident. And whoever was behind it was unlikely to stop once they learned she'd survived. I gathered all the documents back into the folder, but I didn't put it in my bag. I hid it. Instinctively, without thinking it through, I felt that these papers were the only evidence of the truth and that they had to be protected. In that moment, I still didn't know what to do next. I knew only one thing. The woman I'd considered my enemy my entire adult life turned out to be just as much a victim as I was. And now our fates were bound together more tightly than I could have imagined. All that was left was to wait for her to regain consciousness. And to look into the eyes of the woman I'd saved, with eyes that were entirely different now. When someone comes back from the void, the first thing they see is light. And often standing beside that light is the person who pulled them back. In our case, things were far more complicated. Because the woman who opened her eyes in that hospital bed looked up to find the face of someone she'd been taught to hate. And I looked down at her, already knowing the truth she had yet to learn. Between us lay an entire abyss of lies, built by someone else's hands. And someone had to be the first to build a bridge across it. She came around close to morning. They came to tell me. I'd been trying to doze in the on-call room with my head resting on my arms, but I hadn't managed to sleep. I got up and went to the intensive care unit. She was lying there tangled in tubes, pale, with dark circles under her eyes, blinking weakly and uncertainly as she adjusted to the light. When I walked in, her gaze settled on me. At first there was only the confusion of someone who doesn't know where they are or what has happened. And then something flickered across her face. Recognition. And right behind it, fear. She recognized me, I don't know how. Maybe my husband had shown her my photograph at some point, the same way he'd shown me hers. Maybe women always know instinctively the one who's connected to their man. She tried to say something, but only a faint rasp came from her dry throat. I came closer, poured some water, and carefully brought the glass to her lips. "Drink," I said quietly. "Small sips. You mustn't get upset right now." She took a few sips and sank back against the pillow, her frightened eyes never leaving me. "I know who you are," she whispered at last. "You're his wife. Why are you here? Did you perform my surgery?" "Yes," I answered. "They brought you in overnight, a fall from height. You'd lost a lot of blood. I operated on you." Her face contorted. Tears welled in her eyes. "Why?" she whispered again, and there was so much bitterness packed into that single word that my chest tightened. "Why did you save me? You hate me. You're supposed to hate me." "I destroyed your family," she whispered. "He told me that you made him unhappy. And I believed him. God, what a fool I was." And then she wept. Quietly, helplessly, the way people cry when they're exhausted down to the bone and completely broken. I knew the moment had come. I pulled up a stool, sat beside her bed, and did something I never imagined I'd do. I took the hand of the woman who'd ended my marriage, and I spoke to her gently, the way I speak to my most critical patients. "Listen to me," I said. "I'm not going to hate you, not anymore. Because I learned something tonight, and you need to know it too, even though it's going to hurt. But a bitter truth is better than the sweet lie we've both been fed for 2 years." She went still, staring at me with wide eyes. And I told her, not everything at once, she was too weak for that, and as a doctor I rationed the truth carefully, the way you'd administer a powerful drug. But I told her the essentials, that I'd seen the documents, that I knew about the apartment, the forged papers, the way she'd been stripped of everything, that I recognized his handwriting, and that the letter in her bag was written in his hand, that the same man had deceived us both, that she hadn't been a love to him, she'd been a target, just as I hadn't been a wife to him, but a convenient cover. She listened, and I watched the waves move across her face, disbelief, pain, shock, and finally a terrible, bitter recognition. Because deep down, I think she'd understood for a long time. She'd just been afraid to admit it to herself. That's always how it is with people who've been deceived. The truth stands right beside them, and they look away, because looking at it is unbearable. "So it's true," she whispered when I finished. "Everything I suspected, everything I was afraid of. He just used me. And you too. Both of us." "Both of us," I nodded. We sat in silence. Outside the window, dawn was breaking. The first grey light was pressing through the curtain of rain. And in that pale glow, 2 women who should have been each other's worst enemies found themselves closer to one another than to anyone else in the world. Because there's no bond stronger than shared pain and a shared enemy. And then she said something that made my blood run cold. She gripped my hand with weak fingers and began speaking quickly, in a rush, glancing towards the door as though she was afraid of being overheard. "There's something else you need to know," she whispered. "I didn't fall. Do you hear me? I didn't fall on my own. That evening I was going to file a report. I'd finally made up my mind. I was tired of being afraid. I wanted to tell everything. And he found out. I don't know how, but he did. He came to me. We were on the balcony. He was saying we'd work it all out. And then the only thing I remember is the ground disappearing from under me. It wasn't an accident. He wanted me silent for good. And now that I've survived, he won't stop. He'll come. He'll come to finish what he started." I looked into her frightened eyes, and a chill ran down my spine, because I knew she was right. A man capable of this wouldn't leave a witness alive. And the only place that witness was right now was my hospital, my shift, my responsibility. And somewhere out there, beyond the curtain of rain, a man was waking up in the city. A man who would very soon learn two things: that his victim had survived, and that the one who'd saved her was none other than his own discarded wife. The most dangerous predators don't growl, they smile. They shake your hand, bring you flowers, call you the only one. And then, once you've trusted them completely, once you've opened every door and lifted every lock, they take everything from you and walk away, leaving nothing but scorched earth behind. My husband was exactly that kind of predator. And the most terrifying part was that I'd lived with him for 15 years and never seen his real face. It only revealed itself now, when I'd gathered all the pieces of someone else's pain into a single picture. That morning, after sending my patient to rest and leaving the duty nurse outside her room with strict instructions to let no one in without my say-so, I locked myself in the doctor's lounge and laid all the documents out in front of me again. Now, knowing what my patient had told me, I read them in an entirely different light. Before, they'd just been papers. Now they were a map of a crime. The picture that emerged was monstrous in its deliberateness. My husband hadn't acted on impulse, hadn't acted in the heat of the moment. He'd acted on a plan, one he'd been developing slowly and in cold blood. Even while he was still living with me, he'd already been looking for his next target. A woman alone, with property and no family to stand up for her. He studied them, made his choice and moved in. By that point, our marriage had already served its purpose for him. I brought in a steady income. I was a convenient backdrop of respectable domestic life. I didn't ask too many questions because I was always buried in work. A perfect cover. And when a bigger opportunity came along, the apartment, the savings, he simply rewrote the script. Turned me from a wife into an abandoned victim and turned her from a victim into a happy rival. Both roles were lies. I found myself remembering things I'd never paid attention to before. How money had started disappearing in the last years of our marriage, and he always had an explanation. How he'd had me sign papers he'd registered in his name. Papers he'd slipped in front of me, and I, worn out after a double shift, had signed without looking because I trusted him. How he'd always asked about my work schedule. I'd thought it was jealousy or care, but he was simply calculating when I wouldn't be home. Every memory now turned to show its other face, and it was enough to make me physically ill. But the worst of it was something else. I understood that a man capable of building a scheme like this in cold blood, capable of walking a woman out to a balcony and pushing her over the edge, would not leave the job unfinished. My patient was right. He'd come. The only question was when and how. He didn't keep us waiting long. Around midday, as I was doing rounds, still without sleep, the duty nurse called out to me from her station. "Anna Sergeyevna, there's a man asking for you. Says he's a relative of the patient admitted overnight. Very insistent. Demanding to see her." Everything inside me dropped. I walked to the glass door leading to the lobby and looked through it. He was there, my ex-husband. Expensive coat, a bouquet of flowers in his hands, his face a portrait of concern and anxiety. The perfect image of a devoted loved one. He was playing the role so convincingly that the nurse at the station was visibly sympathetic. No one looking at this polished, handsome, worried man would ever have suspected what he actually was. I stood behind the glass and looked at the man I'd lived with for 15 years. And for the first time in 2 years, I felt no pain, no resentment, no grief for what I'd lost. I felt only a cold, clear, crystalline resolve. Because in that room lay a woman he'd already tried to kill once. and now the only thing standing between him and his victim was me. The discarded wife he'd written off as spent material. What he didn't yet know was that this spent material had spent 17 years in emergency surgery learning never to retreat. Not ever. Not for anything. I took a deep breath, straightened my coat, and pushed through the glass door to meet him. Do you know what happens when two victims of the same predator finally find each other? The predator feels afraid for the first time in his life. Because alone we were weak. Alone we could be deceived, intimidated, crushed. But together we became something he'd have to reckon with. He'd counted on us hating each other. He'd set us against one another himself to make sure we'd never sit down at the same table and compare what he'd told each of us. And now here we were, sitting at that table. The last thing he'd ever expected. I walked out to meet him in the lobby. He saw me, and for just a fraction of a second something genuine crossed his face. Real surprise, before he tucked it behind the mask.
Anya, he said, his voice full of manufactured warmth. Anya, what are you doing here? You work here? I had no idea. Listen, there's someone, a friend of mine was admitted. I'm so worried. Please, let me through to see her. I looked at him and marveled that I'd never seen it before. All of it laid bare. How smoothly he lied. How easily he referred to the woman he'd killed as just an acquaintance. How he played on my feelings, expecting the wife he'd discarded to melt at a single word from him. Once I would have, but not anymore. She can't have visitors, I told him, my voice steady. She's in serious condition after surgery, no exceptions. Those are the rules. His face flickered almost imperceptibly. Anya, come on, you're a doctor. You can make an exception, he said, his voice dropping to something silky as he stepped closer. He reached out as if to touch my shoulder out of old habit. We're not strangers to each other. Help me. I really need to see her, right now. And in that right now, in the insistence of it, in the faint shadow of impatience that crossed his face, I read everything. He needed to get to her urgently, while she was still weak, while she hadn't fully come around, while she couldn't talk. I stepped back, opening the distance between us. Come during visiting hours, I said in that same level tone, and bring documentation proving your relationship to the patient. Without that, I won't let anyone through. I'm sorry. I turned and walked away, feeling his eyes on my back. And those eyes were no longer warm. They were heavy, angry, calculating. He understood that something had gone wrong, that the wife he'd written off as broken was behaving strangely. He was smart, my ex-husband, too smart, and that made him twice as dangerous. I went back to my patient. She was frightened. She'd seen him through the window when he came. I sat down beside her and spoke plainly. He was here. I didn't let him in. But he'll come back, and next time he'll find something cleverer. We can't just hide and wait. We need to move first. And so we did. I knew the documents from the bag weren't enough on their own. They could be dismissed as forgeries, challenged in court. We needed testimony. We needed someone from the outside, someone who knew how to untangle cases like this. And that someone existed. I had a patient from years back, a man I'd once pulled through after a serious accident. Older, a man of few words, who'd spent his whole career as an investigator before retiring. More than once, after his discharge, he'd told me, "Doctor, if you ever need help, any kind at all, call me, any time. I always pay my debts." I decided that hour had come. He arrived that same evening. He listened carefully, without interrupting. He leafed through the documents with his dry, aged fingers, put on his glasses, and read closely. Then he took off his glasses, pinched the bridge of his nose, and said quietly, "This is serious, doctor. Very serious. But if everything is as you say, this man has already crossed a line there's no coming back from. And people like that don't stop halfway. He'll try to cover his tracks. And the main track he needs to cover is lying in your ward right now. We need to move quickly. We talked well into the night. The old investigator knew what to do, knew where to go and who to speak to, how to set the paperwork in motion, how to keep it all lawful so it wouldn't fall apart. My patient, pushing through her weakness, dictated everything she remembered into his recorder. The scheme, the threats, that evening on the balcony. Her voice trembled, but she held herself together. I watched something new stir awake in that broken woman. Not fear, anger. The kind of anger that lifts a person off their knees. We said goodbye well past midnight.
The old man paused at the door on his way out and said something that unsettled me. "Watch over her, doctor, and watch over yourself. A cornered animal is at its most dangerous. He knows now that you've joined forces. That means you're both a threat to him. I'll be back tomorrow with people we can trust, but tonight, just hold on. Just hold on through the night." I didn't yet know how literally I'd have to take those words. A hospital at night is a different world entirely. During the day, it's full of people, noise, commotion. At night, all that's left is a handful of staff on duty, silence, and long, empty corridors where every footstep echoes. It's the perfect place to save lives, and, unfortunately, the perfect place to take them. That night, I understood this with absolute clarity, because he came anyway. Not during visiting hours, not with documents. He came in the deadest hour of the night when he thought no one would stop him. I hadn't gone home. Of course I hadn't. I'd stayed on shift. Officially, I'd asked to cover it, but really, I simply couldn't leave my patient alone. Around 3 in the morning, in that hollow hour when even the most resilient people can barely keep their eyes open, I was making my way down the corridor and I saw him. He was coming from the direction of the emergency exit. Someone on the staff had let him in, or he'd gotten in himself. I never found out which. He had a white coat thrown over his clothes. Smart. Dressed like that, he could pass for a doctor, walk straight to the room without anyone stopping him, do what he'd come to do, and then dissolve into the night. By morning, everyone would have concluded that the critically ill patient had simply not survived her complications. He didn't notice me right away. I was standing in the shadow of a side corridor, watching him creep toward the room. In that moment, I felt no fear, only one thing, the need to stop him. I stepped out of the shadow directly into his path. "Going somewhere?" I asked quietly. He flinched and turned. He saw me, and several expressions moved across his face in quick succession. Alarm, then anger, then again that smooth, rehearsed mask. "Anya," he whispered, moving closer. "Anya, you don't understand. Let me explain. This woman, she's not who she says she is. She's dangerous. She's been after me. She wants to destroy my life. I came to talk to her, work things out." In a white coat, at night, through the emergency exit, I didn't raise my voice. "Stop lying. I know everything. I've seen the documents. I know about the apartment, the forged paperwork. I know what you did to her. And I know what happened on that balcony. I know all of it." The mask came off. For the first time in 15 years, I saw his real face. It was cold, cruel, pitiless. There was nothing human left in those eyes. "So you've gone poking your nose where it doesn't belong," he said in a completely different voice, low and threatening. "You always were too curious, Anya, too stubborn. Get out of my way. Step aside and I'll forget you ever got involved in any of this. You're smart. You know you can't win against me." I didn't move. I stood between him and that room, an unarmed, bone-tired woman in a worn coat. And I looked him straight in the eye. "You're right about one thing," I said. "Once, I couldn't have won against you.
Once I was afraid of you, even though I didn't know who you really were. But you know what's changed? I'm not alone anymore. At that moment, the lights in the corridor came on. I'd planned it all. We'd planned it all, the old investigator and I. He hadn't waited until morning. He'd sensed something was wrong and had come with his people the previous evening, positioning them quietly throughout the floor. The whole time my ex-husband had been threatening me, every word he said was being recorded. And now the corridor filled with people. The old investigator stepped out from around the corner. The people he'd spoken of, the ones who could be trusted, appeared. And in the doorway of the room, gripping the door frame, pale but standing straight, was the woman he'd already written off as nearly dead. His victim. Alive. He spun around like the cornered animal the old man had warned me about. He looked for a way out, but there was none. The circle had closed. And then he looked at me, with a hatred I had never seen on a human face. But behind that hatred, for the first time, something showed through that he had never let show before. Fear. Plain animal fear. The fear of a man caught. "You'll regret this," he hissed as they led him away. "You'll regret all of it, Anya." I said nothing. There was already plenty in my life that I regretted, but I would never regret that night. There's an old truth I'd learned over years of practice. The body can be fooled for a time, pain suppressed, symptoms masked, a reckoning deferred. But sooner or later, everything hidden works its way to the surface, and the longer a disease has been concealed, the harder it is to treat. People are no different. A lie can be kept for years, dressed up in a beautiful facade, acted out like a role. But the truth, like a neglected illness, will break through in the end, and when it does, it demands payment for everything at once. They took him away that same night. What followed was a long, grinding process I won't describe in full. Grey, bureaucratic, filled with interrogations, expert assessments and waiting. But here's what matters. The truth came out, all of it, right down to the bottom. It turned out that my patient and I weren't the only ones. An experienced investigator pulled on one loose thread and unraveled an entire knot. My ex-husband had done this before. There had been another woman before her. And, it seems, another one before that. For years he'd lived like a parasite, moving from one victim to the next, preying on women who were alone, women who had no one to stand up for them. He chose them carefully. He studied their vulnerabilities. He gave them what they desperately lacked: attention, warmth, hope, and then took everything they had in return. And the most frightening part was that some of his earlier victims never found the courage to speak. They stayed silent for years, crushed by shame and fear, convinced they'd brought it on themselves. That's how this ugly machinery works. The victim is made to feel guilty, so she says nothing, and the predator moves on. Many people came forward with testimony, and my patient, I can no longer think of her as anything other than someone close to me, carried herself through those interrogations with a dignity I hadn't seen in her at first. The broken, dying woman who'd been brought to me in the middle of the night was gradually disappearing. In her place, someone else was emerging, someone who'd found the strength to fight. I gave testimony too. I talked about our marriage, the forged signatures, the way I'd been used as cover. Standing before people in uniform and saying all of it out loud, I felt something lift from my shoulders. A weight I'd been carrying for 2 years. The weight of guilt. Because for those 2 years, somewhere deep down, I'd been blaming myself. Maybe I really was a bad wife, I'd thought. Cold, unfeeling, always at work. Maybe it was my fault he left. But now I understood. No, not me. It had never been my fault. I'd simply been used by a very bad man,
and in my kindness and naivety, I hadn't seen it. He was going to answer for all of it, for the fraud, for the forged documents, for what had happened on that balcony. And the investigation proved it was no accident. The law closed around him, slowly but surely. And you know what surprised me? When I finally saw him for the last time at the trial, I felt no triumph, no gloating. I looked at this man I had once loved, this man I'd given 15 years of my life to, and felt only a vast, quiet sadness. Sadness at how much harm can fit inside one charming, handsome person. And gratitude to fate for pulling me free of his grip, however brutal the means. He tried to say something to me across the courtroom. He caught my eye, twisted his lips into something resembling his old smile, but I looked straight through him. He had no power over me anymore. His words, his looks, none of it reached me. He had become a stranger, someone peripheral, already almost unreal. And most importantly, he couldn't hurt anyone else. That mattered more than any revenge. After the trial, the two of us walked out into the street together, me and the woman I had once hated. It was a clear day, rare for that time of year. She suddenly stopped, turned to face me and said, "You know, I never actually thanked you. You saved my life twice. Once on the table and once when you opened my eyes. If it weren't for you, I would have died still believing it was all my fault. Thank you." I couldn't find any words. I simply took her hand and we walked on together. Two women whom fate had brought together in the cruelest way, then bound together in the strongest. There was still a great deal ahead. She would need to reclaim what had been stolen, rebuild her life, heal not just her body but her soul. I would need to learn how to live again, free of guilt and free of old pain. But the hardest part was behind us. The long night was ending. Dawn was beginning to show on the horizon. 6 months have passed. I'm sitting here writing these words late in the evening by a window where the first snow is falling quietly outside. And you know what's strange? For the first time in a very long while, I feel calm. Not even happy. Real happiness is probably still something I need to grow back into. But calm. That deep, steady stillness inside that I had missed so badly all these years. For a long time, I couldn't name what I was feeling. Then I understood. It's the feeling of someone who has finally been relieved of a burden too heavy to carry. The burden of guilt for another person's evil. A great deal has changed in these 6 months. The woman I once thought of as my worst enemy has become someone truly dear to me. We rarely talk about what brought us together. The past is too heavy to stir up. But we often just sit over tea, the two of us, in silence, looking out the window. There's a particular closeness between people who've been through the same fire. Words aren't needed. She's recovering, little by little. Some of what was stolen has been returned to her. Not everything, because nothing is ever fully restored, but enough to get back on her feet. More importantly, something else has come back to her. The will to live. I watched that small flame, nearly extinguished on the terrible night, burn brighter and brighter inside her. And for me, as a surgeon, that was a deeper healing than any operation. Because I know how to suture a torn vessel, but to give a person back their will to live, that's a miracle I can only ever witness. The person has to work it themselves. I think about that night often, about standing over her gurney in the examination room and feeling that dark wave rise inside me. About the moment I allowed myself to think that I didn't have to try. And I'm grateful to fate and to my own hands that I didn't follow that thought through. Because imagine, just for a moment, what would have happened if I had. I wouldn't only have failed to save an innocent person, I would have let a real criminal win completely, erase the last trace, escape accountability, and find a new victim. And I would have remained a monster in my own eyes forever,
even if no one had ever found out. There's a court more terrible than any on earth. It's the one we hold over ourselves, alone with our conscience in the dark. And I'm glad there's nothing to answer for when I face that court. People sometimes ask me, don't I grieve those 15 lost years? Doesn't it hurt to know I spent so much time with a man who was using me? And before, I probably would have said yes. It grieves me, it hurts, it's bitter enough to bring tears. But now I answer differently. Those years weren't lost. They made me who I am. They taught me to work in such a way that my hands didn't falter even over someone I hated. They hardened me enough that I could hold myself together that night when someone else's life was on the line. Everything we go through serves a purpose. Even the most bitter pain will turn into strength one day if you can survive it without breaking. And something new has entered my life as well. Something tentative and quiet, not yet fully named. That same seasoned investigator who helped us back then turned out to be a man of remarkable warmth beneath his stern, quiet exterior. We've started seeing each other occasionally, first for reasons related to the case, then simply because. He brings me books he thinks I absolutely must read. We walk through the city in the evenings and either say nothing or talk about everything. I'm not making plans. I know far too well how life can break a hope. But for the first time in a long while, I'm allowing myself to hope quietly again. And that alone is already a small miracle. The snow outside keeps falling, covering the city in a clean white blanket, washing away, the way that rain once did, everything old and soiled and done with its hurting. I watch it and think about how strangely and wisely life arranges itself. How it brought two women to the same operating table so that through pain and truth it could set them both free. How the worst betrayal turned out, in the end, to be a form of salvation. How hatred became friendship and deception was punished in its own time. I don't know who will read these words someday, but if you're reading them now, carrying the weight of someone else's guilt on your shoulders, if someone once betrayed you, used you, made you believe that everything was your own fault, know one simple thing: it isn't true. The truth always comes to the surface, and those who sow evil will reap it themselves, sooner or later, down to the very last seed. And those who, despite everything, held on to the ability to save rather than destroy, fate will always pay that goodness back. Maybe not right away. Maybe by a strange and roundabout path, but it will. The long night ends. Always. Do you hear me? Always. Even the darkest night gives way to dawn. You just have to find a way to hold on until it comes.